Thank you for joining us today. My name is Lindsay Ferlito, and I am the Dairy Management Specialist with the CCE North Country Regional Ag Team. And I'm joined today with Betsy Hicks, who's the Dairy Specialist with the CCE South Central New York team. We're glad you could join us. And this program came about because Betsy had some requests from farms to just review the farm program version 4.0 updates. So we thought we would run through that and then provide some data from New York and just kind of talk about what we're seeing and where we are at. Okay, so we're going to start with a poll question to make sure everyone is awake. So our first poll question today is what you're hoping to learn more about today. So there's a ton we could talk about with the farm program. We only have an hour. So just so I have a bit more information and can tailor things, you've got a few different options there. Are you hoping to find out what's involved with the farm evaluation, more on written protocol requirements or employee paperwork requirements, focusing more on the animal observations, specifically the corrective action plans, or is there something else you were hoping for? And then please feel free to put that in the chat box so that we can address it.
All right, I'm going to end the poll and share results. So looks like most popular are farm evaluation and written protocol requirements, followed closely by paperwork requirements for employees and animal observations and corrective action plans. So looks like everything is important. So we're all in the right
Perfect.
spot. This is great.
I apologize for this delay. There we go. Just as taking a step back, what the farm program is, it came about through the National Milk Producers Federation, and dairy farms participate through their cooperative. The cooperatives opt into the program. And then if the cooperative does that, then you as a participating farm of that co-op are therefore part of the farm program. The program started back in 2009, and it now covers 99% of the US milk supply. So pretty much any milk that is leaving the farm and going to a processing plant is going to be part of the farm program. That 1% basically covers any sort of on-farm processing or sales at the farm level. Just a timeline too of how it has evolved. Version 1 and version 2 were very much voluntary and didn't have a lot of teeth. And then even though version 3 and 4 are still technically voluntary, they're not really because almost every co-op participates. So version 3.0 came out in 2017, and that's when we saw some really big changes, such as phasing out of tail docking and some more of the paperwork, like the vet client patient relationship form and the cow care agreement form, and some more of these mandatory corrective actions. Version 4.0, what we're focusing on today, that started in January of 2020. And normally, as you can see from this timeline, normally the versions last for 3 years at a time. So originally, version 4.0 was supposed to end the end of this year, because we're in 2022 now. But because of COVID, when all farm activities basically were shut down for about 18 months, they then decided to extend this for 18 months. So version 4.0 will now end at the end of June 2024. And then we get version 5. So we'll do this again in a couple of years. And they are already getting input from farmers and industry about version 5 and working on that. So also just to provide a little bit of background information, there are a lot of different bodies that put input into the farm program and who makes decisions. So at the bottom there, you've got the Farm Advisory Council, as well as an open comment period. So that's the open comment period is for anybody to provide input. So they just had that for version 5.0. And then the Farmer Advisory Council that is comprised of farmers, veterinarians, researchers, industry members. And then they have a technical writing group that again has different members of the industry, including farmers, an animal well-being committee, and then you have the National Milk Producers Board of Directors. So over 130 people are involved in the process of making a new version of the farm program, and there is quite a bit of input from actual dairy farmers. A reminder too of what the program is trying to achieve. It is just a snapshot of farm management practices. Most farms are only getting an evaluation every 3 years. So it is a snapshot in time of when the evaluation was taken. And it's really trying to be outcomes-based and science-based and stay facility and size neutral. And they're trying not to be prescriptive and focus on those outcomes. So as long as we're getting to the same outcome, it's up to you how to get there as the dairy farmer. But it does still require on-farm monitoring and oversight and active participation on farm into these protocols and following the guidelines. So one of the first questions on the poll was what's involved in a farm evaluation. So when you have your evaluation, usually it's done by your cooperative. Most cooperatives have someone on staff that's trained as an evaluator. Some of the smaller cooperatives have outsourced this and will just hire a third party or a second organization to do this. But what should happen is that evaluator should contact you, usually about 2 weeks ahead of time, and let you know that you are due for your evaluation. And they'll set up a date and time that works for you. And they're supposed to be relatively flexible. So obviously if they call, in the middle of harvesting season and say, I'm coming next Monday, you can say, no, that's unreasonable. So they are supposed to work with you and try to be flexible. Then when they come to the farm, they're going to do some paperwork and kind of some pre-evaluation. So they'll sit down with you, go over all the paperwork requirements, talk to you about the farm, and then they'll go out into the barn, walk through the barn, look at the animals, and then they're supposed to come back and sit down with you and kind of have a post-evaluation discussion. And that's when they could go through what they saw, identify any of those mandatory or continuous improvement plans, and work with you on how to achieve them. For the paperwork review, one of the main things they're looking for is the animal care agreement. So that's the agreement for anyone who's working hands-on with your animals. So if you have someone on staff that literally just drives a truck or just sits in a tractor, they don't need to sign this. But it's for anybody that at any time might have some animal stockmanship responsibilities. They have to sign the animal care agreement. And that is stating that they will not mistreat or abuse your animals, and that they understand that there's a policy in place on the farm that is against that behavior, and that they will report that behavior if they see it immediately. There's continuing education requirements for those areas. And then you need to have your veterinarian client-patient relationship form. So that's your veterinarian that you work with on a regular basis. And this form has to be signed annually. There's the herd health plan, and there's various things that need to be included there. And again, that needs to be reviewed and signed annually with your herd veterinarian. So for the paperwork, again, we need the fitness for transport protocol. So how are we identifying animals that are going to leave the farm? Pre-weaned calf care, non-ambulatory or down animals, and then euthanasia. They also would like to see protocols for things like a milking protocol, pest control, fly control, parasite control, a biosecurity protocol, permanent treatment records. Animals should be permanently identified. You should have emergency contact information listed and posted in obvious places around the farm. So if you have a situation that requires emergency assistance, make sure that your employees can actually get to that. It's got your physical address so that if they had to call 911, they know what address to provide them with. Emergency action plans and crisis plans. And one of the big differences with version 4.0 is with the paperwork review is matching the action to the protocol. So the first step here is there a protocol? So for example, is there a protocol for providing colostrum to calves? Yes, great. Then as part of the evaluation, I forgot to mention, the evaluator, when they're looking at the animals and walking through the barn, they will be observing also your employees to see how they are treating the animals, if it looks like they're following those protocols. They may also interact with your employees and ask them, oh, I see you're feeding colostrum. What's your protocol? How do you do that? So they're going to try to determine if the action actually meets your protocol. And then they also want to make sure that that action is acceptable. So if you had a protocol for down cows, and then does the action actually meet that protocol? And then is that action acceptable? Are they moving that down cow in a humane, approved manner? So that's that extra step this time, because before they were seeing some discrepancies where, yes, they had a protocol, that's great, but they were doing something completely different on farm. So essentially you don't have a protocol then, because it's not what your employees are doing. So we want to make sure that you have that protocol, it's being followed, and it's something that's acceptable within the industry. So for the animal observation section, they are going to walk through all the animals and look for signs of neglect. They will walk throughout the whole facility And they're going to record any animals that are downed animals, severely emaciated animals, severe lameness, anybody with a catastrophic injury, make sure that everyone has access to water and feed, as well as protection from heat and cold. For version 4, they've also changed the animal classes. So there's now 4 separate classes of animals that are observed. There's the pre-weaned heifers. So this is starting at day 3 and up. So if a heifer was literally just born right before the evaluation, they're not going to check her. They're going to give her a couple days to get up on her feet. There's heifers, and then there's pre-fresh cows and heifers and lactating cows. If there's less than 100 animals in each of those classes, all the animals in that group will be scored. If there's more than 100 animals in that class, then only up to 100 animals will be scored. So that way, if we're on a 200 cow Tiestall dairy, most of those animals are probably going to get scored. Whereas if we're on a 3,000 cow dairy, they're not going to score every cow. They're going to score a maximum of 400 cows then, because it'll be 100 in each of those groups. For pre-weaned heifers, they are going to be looking at females and males. So if you did have some bull calves on farm that were 4 or 5 days old, they will also be checked for signs of neglect, body condition score, and hygiene. And if, like I said, if there's less than 100, you're going to score them all. If there's more than 100, you're going to divide that evenly across the age group. So we're getting a good snapshot of those pre-weaned calves. For the post-weaned calves, same idea, signs of neglect, body condition score, and hygiene. And in this case, if there's more than 100, they're basically going to try to pick 50 from a young group and 50 from an old group, just so we're not going into every single pen. So also trying to recognize, some biosecurity and minimize disturbing pens. For pre-fresh cows and heifers, they will be looking at signs of neglect and hygiene, and again, scoring them from as few pens as possible while still getting a representative snapshot of that group. For lactating cows, they're going to be looking at a lot more. So again, looking at signs of neglect, as well as body condition score and hygiene. But now they're also going to be looking at locomotion or lameness, hock injuries, knee injuries, and broken tails. And I think this is a difference with 4.0. Before, hock and knee injuries used to be combined, so it was the worst of the two. Now they're separate. So there's hock injuries and then there's knee injuries separately. And again, if there's less than 100, we score them all. And if there's more than 100, we try to capture that from as few pens as possible. So again, we're not disturbing too many animals. For the hocks, it's okay to score 100 cows from one group or as few groups as possible. And doing so in the parlor is a really easy way to do that. So you may see the evaluator in the parlor for part of the time and then back out in the pen. For locomotion scoring, ideally, we're going to target that older group or your high producing cows, and either they need to score the whole pen or the last 100 cows of the pen, because we know from previous research that lameness tends to be higher in the last third of the group leaving the parlor. So basically, lame cows are kind of slower to get up, to get to the holding area. They kind of hang out in the back of the holding area. So it's not really representative if we're just scoring the first 100 cows out of the parlor in a large group of cows. This chart just summarizes basically everything I just said. So it's breaking it down by each class of animals and showing you what they would be looking for. So again, everybody's looked at for signs of neglect, including the hospital pen. So to make sure that hospital pen, those animals still have access to feed and water, bedding, protection from the elements. And then most of those groups are going to get scored for hygiene and then body condition. And then, like I said, the lactating cows are the only ones that are looked at for the lameness, hocks, knees, and broken tails. That broken tails was also added with version 4 after some things that were noticed, or after the ban on tail docking with version 3, they decided to add broken tails as an observation for version 4. So just to outline what they're looking for when we're talking about these different animal-based measures. I apologize because this picture is really not that great, but this is the one that farm provided. So I wanted to share it. This is for body condition scoring. So it's using the 5-point scale. They are scoring on whole points. So they're really focusing on those ones. They don't really care if your cows are a 3 or a 4. That means that your animals are getting enough feed. What they care about is whether or not these animals are a 1 or are close to being a 1. So their goal with this, when they're scoring those classes of animals, is that 99% or more of the animals scored are a 2 or greater. No animal should be a 1 on a dairy farm, is essentially what we're saying. Another change with version 4.0 is a change to how they scored the hygiene. And this, I think, is a positive because working with farms, definitely heard a lot of feedback regarding frustration with how hygiene was scored originally, because before they were looking at the whole animal, and a lot of producers would get frustrated if cows were scored as dirty because they had a little bit of manure or dirt on their legs, their lower legs, because it is very challenging to not have any manure. Or if you had a pasture situation, it was a wet day and the cows come in with a little bit of mud up their leg. So I think this is a big positive for how they adapted with version 4.0. And again, just kind of taking a step back and remembering that chart I showed of the structure of how farm was created. Whenever they change a scoring system like this, like the hygiene system, they have a whole hygiene committee, and it's a whole work group, and they meet for many months and discuss. And again, this is producers, veterinarians, industry members, researchers, and they will literally sit down and discuss how this should be recorded so that it's actually helpful as well as feasible for an evaluator to come on your farm and do. And so this group recognized that the previous scoring system wasn't super representative. So they came up with this new scoring system. So basically what they did was they took the animal, and this is for a calf and a heifer, and they broke her down into these 2 areas. So A, kind of her upper leg, and then B would be like her flank and her front and kind of above her front knees. She scored clean if no area or no part of these 2 areas has mud or manure that exceeds 5.5 inches in length. So she could have a little spot of mud or manure and she's fine. But if it gets to be 5.5 inches in length or bigger in one continuous area, then she's no longer considered a score 1. She would be a score 2 if that was in one area. So she could have one dirty spot right there on B and nothing in A. So she would score a 2. If she's got a spot in B and a spot in A, so indicating she's got quite a bit of mud or dirt on her, then she'd be a score 3. So she would be considered dirty. So their benchmark is that 90% or more of the animals are going to score a 2 or less. So she could have a little bit of manure or mud on her, but we don't want to see that excessive manure and mud. The only thing that changed on this slide is that now we're talking about older heifers and cows. And because it's a larger animal, the number then increased to 11 inches. So now if that section of manure or mud is 11 inches or greater, it then gets categorized into that score 2 or 3. And this is where they tried to be, I think, a little bit more practical in coming up with, 11 inches seems kind of random. If you had an 11 by 8 piece of paper with you as you're doing some recordings out in the barn, 11 inches is kind of a reasonable thing. And then we fold that in half, we get 5.5 inches. So it does seem a little bit arbitrary, but I think it's a lot better of a system than before. By scoring some animals now, I feel like this is a better way of catching animals that are dirty. It also, the other thing that was the concern with the previous scale was if an animal had a nice long tail now, and she was, maybe that tail got a little bit dirty and had flicked some manure or dirt onto her hind end, people were frustrated that was then making that whole cow considered dirty. So again, that area is not being looked at, and the ankle area kind of down by her hoof is not being looked at. So it's a lot more representative of whether or not this animal is clean or not. And again, we're looking at 90% or more of the animals scored a 2 or less. Locomotion scoring. So this is just for our lactating cows, and they're using a 3-point scale. So a score of 1 is sound. She walks easily. She has maybe only minimal changes to her gait, but she does not have a limp or any sort of major asymmetry in her gait. A score 2 would be considered kind of like slightly lame or moderately lame. This is when we see some asymmetry in her gait, and she has maybe some shortening of the strides, a slight limp, just uneven weight bearing between her limbs. Score 3 is severe lameness. This is when she has trouble bearing weight on a limb. It's obvious lameness. Almost anyone could tell you that cow is lame. She probably has a back arch, and she probably has a head bob to try to compensate for that weight bearing on that leg. The goal with the farm program here is that 95% or more of our animals should be scoring a 2 or less. So we could have some slightly lame cows, but we need to have less than 5% severe lameness in the lactating pen. For the hocks, this is the same scoring chart as the knees, which I'll show you next. A score of 1 is normal. There's no swelling and there's only minimal hair loss. So if it's less than the size of a quarter in length or width, so about an inch, then it's considered no hair loss. So it's a score of 1. A score of 2 is, again, that moderate. And this is where we might have, this is where we could have hair loss greater than the size of a quarter and no swelling still though. So still mainly just that hair loss. And then score 3, as you can see in that picture, is obvious. It's severe. We have swelling greater than a quarter. So it's obvious swelling sticking out from her leg, or she potentially has an open wound, some bleeding or some pus. The goal is to have 95% or more of our animals scoring a 2 or less. And as I said, the knees is the same scoring. So 1 would be nothing or hair loss less than a quarter. A score of 2 is moderate with hair loss greater than the size of a quarter, or maybe some very minimal swelling, but less than a quarter. And then as you can see in that picture, score 3 is severe. We've got obvious swelling more than an inch from her leg out and or that open wound and bleeding. And again, that goal is 95% or more of our animals scoring a 2 or less. And then broken tails. So this one's pretty obvious. It's either broken or it's not broken. So what they're looking for is, as you can see in that picture, and I apologize, that's kind of a grainy picture, but a broken tail that has swelling or a deviation that can be seen or felt, evidence that tail is broken. And then a not broken tail is not that. And we're looking for 95% or more of our animals to be scored to not have a broken tail. So recognizing that, yes, it can happen sometimes, but the majority of your pen should not have a broken tail. So focusing on the action plans and what this means and kind of what would happen after your evaluation based on what the evaluator found. So there's 3 different categories of action plans that we'll walk through. So the most severe and immediate is the immediate action plan. The only thing that triggers an immediate action plan is tail docking. So if you have an evaluation today and the evaluator determines that you have animals that have been in your herd since before 2017. So obviously if you had a cow that was, being milked in 2015 and she already had her tail docked, then yes, she's not going to have a tail now, even though there's the ban in place. But if you've got a 3-year-old cow right now that has no tail, then you've obviously been tail docking since 2017. So you would have 48 hours to comply with a standard. So basically within 48 hours, you need to prove to your evaluator what steps you're going to take to stop tail docking. Pretty simple, stop tail docking. And then once you're in compliance, you're going to have a follow-up visit. So within a week, and then a month later, and then 3 months later, the evaluator is going to come back to ensure that you've taken this seriously and that you actually are no longer tail docking. We did when this first came out in 2017. I recognize this was definitely a hot topic and we got a lot of feedback from producers on it. And I had one producer who had his 3.0 evaluation very early in 2017. So he had stopped tail docking, had his evaluation and was like, great, I can start tail docking again. That's not how it works. And he actually ended up having a follow-up evaluation for something else. And they determined he was tail docking. So that had to stop. But that is the only item that would cause an immediate action plan. And actually, sorry, just to clarify, if worst case scenario, if it was determined that you were tail docking and you are not in compliance with this after 48 hours or after 1 week or 1 month or 3 months, I didn't include all the slides on going on probation because it's just not as fun of a topic. But essentially, if you were caught to be still tail docking and not in compliance with this, you are no longer in compliance with the farm program. Therefore, if your co-op continues to take your milk, they are no longer in compliance with the farm program and cannot say that they're part of the farm program. So what would happen is you would go on probation, and then there's a whole decision tree on how they would work with you to get you off probation. But there is a point where if you don't work with them and don't comply, you will lose your milk market. But there is many steps along the way. So it's not like it would come, you're tail docking, you lose your milk market tomorrow. There's quite a few steps. It's months down the road, but there is that potential outcome. So the next major step would be a mandatory corrective action plan, or when listening to some people talk about farm program, these are also called MCAPs. So these must be met within a maximum of 9 months. Individual co-ops can put on more aggressive timelines if they see fit. So if it's something as simple as getting your vet client patient relationship form signed, they may not give you 9 months. They may say, I'll be back in 2 months and you better have this signed. So 9 months is the maximum amount of time you'll be given, but it could be less. So don't be surprised if your co-op put in a shorter time frame. So you do need to have that written vet client patient relationship form signed by your veterinarian on record. So this should be the person that you work with, that you're buying your drugs from. They know your herd. And you also need to have that written herd health plan that is signed annually by your veterinarian. Pre-weaned calves, this is a difference with 4.0. We now have to have our pre-weaned calves disbudded by 8 weeks of age. And they also have to have access to water and starter by day 3. This is within reason. So recognizing that in New York, in the dead of winter, putting out a water bucket in front of a 4-day-old calf, it's probably going to freeze within a few hours and she's not going to drink much. Within reason, we still need to provide them with water, but maybe that's providing water for an hour or 2 after each feeding. And then we dump it so that it's not just sitting there frozen. Non-ambulatory animals must be moved using the proper methods. They must have access to feed and water and protection from heat and cold. So basically making sure that we're taking care of our down cows appropriately. Following that, acceptable euthanasia practices. So making sure that we're using acceptable practices according to AABP and AVMA, and that we're disposing of the carcass legally and appropriately. And then this one seems so obvious, but it has to be there. Feed and water access for all animals on farm. So that's one where, again, you're probably not going to be given 9 months to get that corrected. Continuing on, these are more mandatory corrective action plans. You need to have written protocols for pre-weaned calf care, non-ambulatory animals, euthanasia, and acceptable fitness for transport. So it needs to be written down. And just a note on the protocols, written is fine, like a physical copy on paper. Having them on your computer is fine too, but they need to be accessible by the people that would read them. And they need to be in the language of the people that need them. So if you have a pre-weaned calf care protocol on the owner's computer and it's in English, and the only people that take care of pre-weaned calf care are hired Hispanics that only speak Spanish and don't have access to that computer, then you do not have a pre-weaned calf care protocol. So it needs to be translated into their native language, and it needs to be available to them whenever they need it. So that could be having a copy on your computer, as well as having a printed out copy where they could access it. Also, if they're on your computer and your computer happens to die the day that the evaluator is there and they can't see proof of any of your protocols, then you don't technically have protocols. So make sure that it is backed up or you have a printed copy somewhere so that you've covered your bases. Again, these are still those mandatory corrective action plans. You need to have that signed cow care ethics agreement, and it needs to be done every year. And what makes this, so there's slight differences here between the mandatory corrective action and the continuous improvement plan. So for any non-family employees, so this would be someone who's hired that is not related to the owners. If they're non-family, then they need to sign this agreement. And if they don't, then it's considered a mandatory corrective action plan. Those same non-family members also have to have continuing education in these areas if they apply to them. So the areas are stockmanship. So basically that would be anyone who's handling your animals. Pre-weaned calf care. So that would be anyone that might be handling a young calf, including anyone who's handling your transition barns, because obviously they would be handling a brand new newborn calf. Non-ambulatory animals. So anyone on your down cow team, or potentially, just your cow pusher or someone that might come across a down cow and therefore have to help move them or know how to respond. Euthanasia, that's usually a pretty short list because usually it's only an owner or manager, a couple people on farm. And then determining if animals are fit for transport. So again, that's usually a pretty short list who's deciding which animals get to leave the farm. But anyone who has those responsibilities has to have continuing education, and we'll talk about what that means, and that's for non-family. So switching now to the kind of less severe, the continuous improvement plans. This is when we have 3 years to meet this target. And again, that's the longest you'll be given, could be given less. So we had to be disbudding our calves by 8 weeks. Now we also have to be providing them with pain management. And that would be with guidance from your herd veterinarian. So if you're not providing any sort of pain management when you're disbudding your calves, that would be a continuous improvement plan. You also have to have permanent and complete drug treatment records, which you already should have to comply with FDA and just to make sure you're, following all your withdrawal times and can track everything. So that's just a good thing to have to begin with. So for the animal observation, so again, this is just reminding you what our targets were, but for body condition, for hocks, for knees, for locomotion, and for broken tails, this would all be a continuous improvement plan. So if you had, say, 15% of your lactating herd had a broken tail, then you would have a continuous improvement plan written up, and you would be given a max of 3 years. For something like that, I would assume that most evaluators are going to give you less time, and they will come back and follow up on a kind of more regular schedule to make sure that's not happening. So when they create these continuous improvement plans, they should be working with you. They should be sitting down with you as the farm owner and with your management team and discussing, okay, here's the problem. We had 15% broken tails. We need to get to 5% or less. What's causing the problem? Where is this issue coming up? Is it with how the animals are being moved from the pen to the parlor? Is it loading in the parlor? Is it some sort of weird issue in the pen with a facility design issue? So addressing the problem, and then as a group coming up with an action plan. So how do you plan on fixing it? What's reasonable for you guys? And what are you going to do? And then putting that down on paper. And then when they come back, they'll check in with you, see if you've implemented those things and if it's working. Continuing with those more, with the continuous improvement plans. So this is where it gets a little bit confusing. So again, we're talking about that signed cow care and ethics agreement annually, but this time it's for family members and family employees. And again, continuing education in those 5 areas, but only for family employees. So for anyone who's handling your cows, they have to have a signed cow care agreement. If they're non-family, it's a mandatory corrective action. If they're family, it's a continuous improvement plan. And then same with the continuing education. The thing with family is you also can have one person sign on behalf of the family. So if you had a husband and wife, one person can sign on behalf of the family. But then also just keep in mind that means that one person is going to be responsible for those other actions of those people. So say you had, a mom and a dad, and they had their 3 kids helping them on the farm. They could choose to have one family member sign off for their children as well, so that they don't have to record those individually.
So we want to know, there's 2 questions in this poll. One, has your farm gone through an FARM evaluation? And we want to know if it's yes, was it before January 2020 or after? So we're getting at, was it 3.0 or 4.0? No, you have not, or you're not sure. And then for the second question, if you did have an evaluation, what were the outcomes of it? Did you receive feedback after the evaluation? Or not? Did you receive feedback but no corrective actions? Corrective actions identified but no support or resources were identified? Or were there corrective actions identified and support was provided to you, or other? And go ahead and type that into the chat to Lindsay and I. Has your farm gone through an evaluation? 1 said yes before 2020 and 2 said yes after 2020. And then if yes, receive feedback but no corrective actions to work on.
Great. Okay.
Great.
Good. So what we were trying to get at here, as Betsy said, was obviously yes, whether or not people had any evaluations, have had a 4.0 evaluation, and then whether or not you receive feedback. Because we have heard, and not to name names or anything, but we've just heard from some people that they feel like their evaluator didn't provide them with enough feedback at the end, or maybe they were provided with a corrective action but weren't given any guidance. So just trying to suss out here if you were provided with some feedback, and then if you felt like you had the support you needed. So that's good to see. So like I said about the continuing education, this doesn't have to be something grand and formal. What you basically need to do is just document that you've provided your employees with training. So this could be working with an industry specialist on your farm. So when your vet comes maybe and does like a milker training, or like a calving training or down cow training, or any sort of training that your vet might provide for these animals, document it, write down which employees attended and when it was and what they did. If your nutritionist talks to anybody about feed management or just handling animals or something, if quality milk is there, cooperative extension, So just write those things down. Dairy industry meetings. So if Betsy puts on a calf care program and you send your calf manager, that counts. Also, just the obvious of job shadowing. Most farms aren't just going to say, okay, go milk my cows. You would have someone train them, show them what to do, and they would kind of be buddied up with somebody to shadow them to gain that experience. That's also considered continuing education. Obviously, still, there's also formal education. So if they actually went and took a class or did some sort of online course, reading articles. If you come across an article in Horde's Dairyman about how you should decide which animals are fit for transport, that counts. And then there's also a lot of webinars and training videos specifically tailored to the farm program and these guidelines, such as the Merck Dairy Care 365, and farm program has some of their own as well. The key here is to write it down. And with all of this, there is templates online. The farm program website is great because they have a lot of information, but it can be a little bit overwhelming to find exactly what you need. So when in doubt, just reach out to us and ask. So if you're looking for any of these required written documents, farm has a template for them. You don't need to create your own animal care agreement. You're welcome to, as long as it covers the content, but you don't need to create your own. Farm has them, and they have them with a box that has the employee name, the date, and you sign it. So it can be the same piece of paper, and that employee every year just signs the date and they're good for that year. So there's links to the farm program website there, as well as their YouTube videos, as well as Merck. And then just a reminder to reach out to your co-op or your evaluator. Don't be afraid to ask them. If they're the one doing your evaluation, they're allowed to talk to you about what's involved in it and what they're seeing. And obviously, too, your veterinarian is key. You need to have written agreements with them, and they need to be reviewing your protocols. So make sure you have that good dialogue back and forth with your herd veterinarian. And I just remember, too, I apologize. As part of the evaluation, at a minimum, you will be evaluated every 3 years. Each co-op can decide if they would like to do it more. So I know some local co-ops try to do every herd annually. So you may have more, but as a minimum, someone should be evaluating your herd every 3 years. There also is another step to ensure quality control in the farm program in terms of the evaluator. So making sure that the evaluators are doing what they say they're supposed to be doing. So I, as an extension associate, got trained on the farm program. So I'm technically a trained evaluator. I don't do evaluations because that would be a conflict of interest, but I got trained so that I could provide our farmers with the most accurate information on the program and be a better resource. But as an evaluator, I would have to say that I'm doing what I've been trained to do. So farm then hires a third-party auditing organization to audit a select number of farms across the country every year from various co-ops to make sure that a co-op up here in Northern New York is evaluating their animals at the same standards as a co-op over in Southern California, so that we can say that this program has validity and, is consistent across the country. So there's a very small chance that you would then get randomly selected for a third-party audit. That has nothing to do with how you've scored on your evaluation. It's strictly just to make sure, like I said, that there's that consistency between evaluators. So before we jump into how New York is doing, I'd like to get your feedback. So we've got our next poll question here.
All right. Do we think the dairy industry in New York is meeting these targets for lameness and injuries? We have, yes, these targets are very reasonable. The second choice, for most part, yes. Some farms may not be meeting them though. No, but the targets are reasonable and we should work to meet them, or no, these targets are not reasonable. And we would love to hear your thoughts on that. Everybody said, for the most part, yes, we're meeting the targets. Some farms may not be meeting them though.
Perfect. So that's exactly what we're going to show you over our next few slides. So I do want to add too that these targets were created by these work groups looking at where we're at as an industry and keeping in mind of what, should be considered acceptable. So again, it's not like they just said, well, they should have no lameness. That's not realistic. So they have put in targets that, for the most part, these work groups have felt are realistic targets, but could still show purchasers and consumers that we are working towards this continuous improvement of animal care and cow comfort on farms. From the National Dairy Farm Program does put out a year in review every year. So from their one from last year, they did 5,300 version 4.0 evaluations across the country. And just as kind of a snapshot of some of the things that came up as what needs to be worked on, 71% had a valid vet client patient relationship form signed. So that means that 29% did not, probably for various reasons. Sometimes this is just they hadn't signed it in the last year. It's still the same vet. He's been the vet or she's been the vet for 30 years. We just forgot to sign the paper. Sometimes it's the vet on there isn't actually their vet, or maybe they don't have a vet, but that's still definitely an area of opportunity for those farms. 82% met the stockmanship training requirement for family and non-family. And on average, it was about 1.5 continuous improvement plans for each facility and about 2 mandatory corrective action plans per facility. So that those mandatory corrective action plans could be those signed agreements. It would be that VCPR or animal care agreements, but just indicating that we definitely have farms that are meeting those targets, but we have some room to improve to meet them. And just taking a step back and looking at all of North America, Tiestalls and Freestalls, for lameness in particular, where we're at in terms of industry averages. So this is overall lameness. It's not specifically that severe lameness where we want 5% or less, but just to kind of give a snapshot of the variation too. So Tiestalls, 23 to 25% overall lameness. Freestalls, depending on the study, anywhere from 11 to 31%. So lameness is definitely an area that the dairy industry has been working on improving and definitely could improve on more. And it's an obvious welfare concern. So it's definitely something that we need to work on. So I'm going to walk through a few studies that we've been working on across New York, trying to capture some cow comfort measures and animal-based outcomes to see where farms are at and give them feedback on where they're at by benchmarking them to their peers. So this is a project that Betsy and I did a couple years ago now, and we looked at 22 Tiestall dairies in northern and then central New York. And we looked at a bunch of different factors like injuries and lying behavior, as well as lameness. And we benchmarked them to each other and gave those producers a report back. The second project was one that I did up in northern New York with a coworker, and we looked at 31 Freestall dairies. And this was when version 3.0 was coming out, and there was a lot more requirements with farms. So we kind of did some mock farm evaluations on these herds to gauge where the farms were at and to see what areas they might need more resources with. And the third project was Betsy and I and another colleague from the Northwest New York team just completed this last year, 2 years ago. And we looked at 15 Freestall farms, again, looking at some of these same measures like injuries and lameness and body condition, and we benchmarked them. If anyone is, I'm going to run through just the lameness and the injuries data. If anyone wanted more information on any of these projects, let us know, because we have longer final reports from them. So from looking at the lameness on the Freestall farms, one project looked at lactating and dry cows, and another project looked at fresh and high cows, but still pretty similar. We're seeing, in this one, we saw 4% were severely lame, and this other one, we had about 2.5% severely lame. And in this graph, I included the range that we had just to show you that, as you guys indicated on the poll, for the most part, the industry is meeting the target, but there's a huge range. So we had farms that had 0% severe lameness, and then farms that had 20%. So that's a huge jump that they're going to have to do down to 5% or less. For the Tiestalls, it was pretty similar, about 2.5% severe. And again, that pretty big range. So it definitely was individual farm dependent. Looking at hock and knee injuries, again, this one herd looked at lactating and dry cows, or this one study. And then this study looked at fresh and high group. And for this one, it was when hocks and knees were scored together. So this was the worst of the two. And for this study, we looked at it separately. So we can see here too that there is some room for improvement, especially for some farms on hock and knee injuries. They were averaging 7% on this in this study, with some farms really up high. And then in this study, if we looked at each of those individually, about 2.5%, 3% severe with some farms. So that would meet the target, but with individual farms, some of them having that as an area of opportunity. And then this was on Tiestall dairies, same story. We're at or just above that recommendation based on the farm program, with some room to improve on individual farms. I wanted to add this just as a reminder too, that is, I know sometimes it can seem daunting and like a lot of work to have to do a farm evaluation. It's a lot more paperwork just to prove that you're doing what you're already doing and taking good care of your animals. But there is some benefit too, potentially. to get this feedback from an outside perspective, another set of eyes coming on your farm to look at your animals. So this is data from the Novus Cows program, and they looked at, they did cow comfort assessments on high producing lactating cows. The graph on the left is lameness. The one on the right is hock injuries. And they did an assessment, and then they came back 6 months to a couple of years later and did a reassessment. And basically what they found was, by going through this assessment, by having someone hand them a report, benchmark them to others in the industry, show them where they were at, they came up with an action plan and worked towards improving it. It worked. They did have improvements. So it is beneficial to get this feedback on a somewhat regular basis on how you're doing on farm. And then we're just going to share some examples of farms that we've worked with and how they found it beneficial to track this on their farm.
We milk about 42 cows, and we have another 900 cows down the road at a Freestall barn. We focus in genetics and really want to make sure that we have comfortable cows that are high producers and that are going to last a long time in our herd. A little over a year ago, we did an assessment here with Cornell Cooperative Extension, and it made us really look at some of the things we can still improve to make our cows even more comfortable. We have changed some things. We've added some sprinklers and some fans, and are looking to adjust our tie rails so that the cows can eat and drink more freely. We've seen a lot of benefits with the cows lying down longer, especially at the end of the barn. Be able to see actual data to be able to make decisions, because these decisions help our cows, helps our management, and ultimately helps us financially.
That was one example of one of the Tiestall farms that participated in that project that Betsy and I did a few years ago. And they've made some changes and have definitely seen benefits. This is another example of a Tiestall farm in New York, and they made some big and some small changes over the years, and just kind of tracking some of those improvements. So one of the big financial investments they made was they installed a feed pusher robot. So that was obviously a lot of money, but he felt that was beneficial. They then also installed new stall dividers. They raised their tie rail to give their cows more space to eat and to make their stalls just a little bit larger for their animals. They also installed new pasture mats. So the pasture mats obviously had a larger price tag, but to redo those stalls, he actually did them themselves and just used some PVC pipe and moved the tie rail himself. So that was actually quite a bit more financially acceptable. So this is the herd on the right-hand side here. This is before the mats and after the mats. He'd already started putting in his new stalls. So you can see the old ones were that more traditional, just a metal bar dividing each individual stall, and then he ripped those out. He kept a small section of that metal there to then mount the new PVC pipes on, and then moved. So you can see those, he just made short, little more adjustable PVC pipe stalls and moved that neck rail, that tie rail, gave those animals a little bit more space. So that's just another picture there showing just how they can be a little bit more flexible. And he's definitely got some big girls, so just give them a little bit more room to use those stalls. So tracking some improvements, this was not part of a study, but we just did some scoring throughout as he was making these changes. So he saw lameness decrease, hock and injuries decreased, his culling changed. He no longer had to get rid of animals just because of injuries and stuff. He said he was losing some good, large, old cows because they just didn't fit in his stalls before. He also said his repro went up, his preg rate increased, his cows were more comfortable, and ultimately he said it was worth the investment and the hard work. And our last example here, this was from a Freestall that was part of our last study that Betsy and I did with Margaret in Northwest New York. And this is a Freestall farm. And when Betsy did the original assessment, they scored slightly higher than the project benchmark and farm targets for lameness as well as hock injuries. So this graph on the left is lameness, showing about 15% mildly lame and about 6% severely lame. This was looking at lactating cows. And for the hock injuries, they had quite a few mild injuries as well as about 15% severe injuries. So they brought in some outside advisors, they worked with their management team, they brought in some resources, and they made some changes. So they decided to implement a foot bath of just soap on non-treatment days because digital dermatitis was an issue that was causing some of this lameness. Just a note, this was only done a few months before Betsy went back to do a reassessment. So we'll probably see some more improvements because obviously that's not something that just changes overnight. It's going to take some time. They also started adding bedding once more per week to help address those hock injuries. And they started prioritizing making sure that the feet were clean in the parlor so that when they left the parlor, it was the treatment bath was hitting the hoof and not a hoof caked in manure. And they also tried to decrease stocking density. So Betsy went back about a year later and saw that severe lameness had gone from that 6%. So that was the 6% down to 0. Their mildly lame did increase a little bit. So their overall lameness kind of stayed the same, but at least we got rid of those severely lame cows that really have trouble walking. And they're now in compliance with the farm program targets. And for their hock injuries, they greatly reduced the severe issue. And they also improved that mild issue as well. And again, this is a work in progress. So this is only capturing after a few months of changes. Things like lameness and hock injuries take longer to change. And that's why with those continuous improvement plans, you're given longer than, a month, because lame cows aren't just going to recover like that. We need time for these things to take effect. So our last poll question.
Again, 2 questions in this poll. We want to know, after watching what we've presented to you today, after seeing some real world examples of change, are you motivated to make some changes on your farm? Yes or no? And then if yes, what are those changes regarding housing facilities, management factors, protocols, employee training, or something else that we didn't mention? Go ahead and put that in the chat. And so if yes, you can pick more than one. Maybe there's a couple things you want to work on your dairies. So great. We're glad you guys want to work on some stuff, and looks like housing and facilities and then protocols. And so protocols can be super frustrating. If you need help, Lindsay and I are always here to help walk through getting these right and working through them, because there's a ton of protocols need to be written and checked, and we can help you work through them.
Yes. And that's awesome that you guys are motivated to make some changes. And I think I've got on my last slide here, just as a reminder that yes, these changes don't have to be massive or super expensive to have a benefit to the cows. So something like just maybe adding a little bit more bedding or doing it twice a week instead of once a week. If there's any way that you can make those stalls bigger, a little bit more accessible, get these cows lying down longer, or doing some things for heat abatement that will pay back in the long term, so that they don't have to have massive capital investments like building a whole new barn, and we can still see improvements. And as Betsy said, reach out, ask for help, talk to your veterinarian, talk to your cooperative extension. If you're in our, Northern New York or Betsy's region, South Central New York, reach out to us. But people are there to help you. So like with the writing the protocols, like Betsy said, it can be super daunting. Just tackle one at a time, talk to your veterinarian, have them help you. Literally you already have that protocol. It just may not be written down. Just describe what you do. It doesn't have to be 3 pages on how you feed a calf. Just tell me how you feed a calf and then just write that down. That's your protocol. If that's what you do and it just covers the main things, that's all you need. So with that, there's our contact information. If you do have any questions, like we said, feel free to reach out to us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.